So thank you very much for your talk. I found it kind of more complete than the draft of the paper that I read, because, as you also mentioned in the draft, I was kind of surprised not to find any mention of precision estimates in the introduction of empirical or hierarchical predictive processing, right? You talk about precision, but only for the variational base part, but not for the kind of the hierarchical base part. And just as Matteo suggested, I was also thinking that a possible alternative explanation that would not require bringing on board variational base would run along some attentional phenomenon, especially in the Wilbert experiment. That experiment is really interesting. They did quite a bit of careful controls there. And they say that they also tried to control for salience. And in fact, the auditory cue, the falling coin that the subject hears in that experiment, does not seem to affect the dominance, because in the second paradigm, the dominance actually shifts toward the non-cued, the non-punished and non-cued, not exogenously cued percept. Now, this, of course, controls for exogenous and kind of bottom-up cues of attention. But of course, if participants during the experiment are instructed that some of the stimuli, the percepts in that case, will be connected to a higher compensation, this particular percept will be very salient for them in a top-down manner. So the kind of the goal of obtaining higher compensation will drive their attention towards the rewarded percept in the first paradigm and the non-punished percept in the second paradigm. Now, if you look at the hierarchical base story, when you include the not only priors and likelihoods, but the estimation of precision, it seems that in that story you have these two prediction errors, right, connected to the currently non-dominant hypothesis. It seems that this attentional shift, that is goal-driven, top-down attentional bias, so to speak, may affect which of the two prediction errors is deemed to be the more precise at any given time, and therefore the priority for the system to minimize. And this could explain why they switch and why the two percepts become dominant in both paradigms, both in the rewarded and in the non-punished paradigm. So I was wondering whether this sort of explanation is still on the table for Hui and colleagues in the basic sort of hierarchical predictive processing framework. Now, they don't talk about precision that much in the 2008 paper, I agree with you, but then there's a Feldman and Tristan paper of 2009, and Hui and Clark in the books go extensively about precision. So I thought that this was also really a reasonable way of trying to explain this sort of results, and this would be my first question for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very reasonable consideration, and that's why I kind of adjusted it in the slides also to account for Matteo's question. I think that between the shift from reward to punishment, but also to the participant receiving the reward and the reward going to a disliked other, I would just be surprised if attention tracked across all four of those categories in exactly the same way that reward functions. So I wonder whether you're moved by the idea that if it was attention, in fact, so here maybe I'll go back to the slide just to kind of have it in front of us. I'm wondering if you're moved by the idea that if it were precision, in other words, attention on this view, that we should nonetheless sort of see or at least some kind of similar effect when the reward is going to the other recipient here, right? I think the attentional account for me faces the challenge of at least, I would like to hear more about how it would account for the role of reward here, where it has no effect for the other recipient. But yeah, this may not be a satisfactory conclusion, but at least for me, I think I would want to hear more about why precision tracks reward for self but not hated other.
Yeah. If I just may offer a brief reply to that, I think intuitively in this case that you have on screen now, it seems to me pretty plausible that there's no the kind of the stimuli that are rewarding for me are not salient in the same way that the stimuli that are rewarding for others are. In the sense that if I have to look like for something that is particularly that will reward me, I will make an effort to look for that. But if I have to look for someone that will reward another, I might not make the same effort. For example, in an attentional scanning task, that's what my intuition about this sort of case would be, right? So the top-down bias would not be the same, and this could explain why you don't have the same effect or not to the same degree. But going to the other example, I think that there would be a way to test whether there is an attentional effect at play, because I think that the auditory cue that they have in both paradigms is an attentional cue in some sense, right? So even if it doesn't shift in the second paradigm, the dominance toward the punished cued percept, it should have some sort of effect. And one way to confirm that would be to compare the cued punished percept of the dominance of the cued punished percept of the second paradigm with the dominance of the non-cued, non-rewarded percept in the first paradigm. If there is a significant effect there of dominance, this could really mean that there is some sort of, in the sense that the cued, the cued punished percept is more dominant, significantly more dominant than the other one. This could mean that there is an attentional effect in play there. But I think this is not something that the experimenters in that case did not measure. So, but this could be a way to disambiguate this problem. Now, sorry. Yeah. No, go ahead, please.
No, that's really helpful. And I've actually already been considering writing them because there are a lot of other questions where I think a lot of this could be probed by making the stimuli ambiguous, right? Ambiguity and precision, like ambiguity would be the flip side of precision, and I think a lot of work could be further tested by playing around with the ambiguity of the stimuli. But I think I might, in my email, add your question to see if they could just look at the data a little bit and see what they would find. I think it's plausible. I have I have independent reasons for thinking it might not be attention, but that's a very useful suggestion.
Okay. Do I have time for another? I think I do.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So the second point is somehow, so I had kind of a general comment to make about how even the basic hierarchical Bayesian story also brings in some worries about the consequences of cognitive penetration, because there is a lot of relying on prior knowledge and top-down pervasiveness there that might worry people like Firestone and Scholl or Raftopoulos, who kind of hold on to a sort of encapsulated view. But that you already covered in the talk in an excellent way, I think. So I might instead try to push you a little bit on the variational-based explanation of the role of reward. Because in this experiment by Wilberts, again, they had a careful control for subject, even slight awareness that there was something like a subjective effect on the alternation, right? Mm-hmm. They wanted subject to be completely unaware that this was a binocular rivalry paradigm. The subject was seeing two percepts alternating, a blue grating and a red grating, but for all they knew, this could be simply that the screen was showing first a blue grating and then a red grating. They didn't know that there was an effect of dominance. They didn't know that they were seeing different stimuli in different eyes, and they didn't know that there was a subjective degree to the alternation. Now, I wonder, in the paper you make the case of, to illustrate the role of policy selection, you make the case about, perceiving the future health of one's marriage, for example, and try to bring about the desired perceptual state by acting in the appropriate way, depending on the confidence that I have in different policies. And I find it pretty clear to understand the idea of policy selection and how it relates to perception there. But here, since they were actually people who showed in a later interview any degree of awareness or strategy deployment about the task were also excluded at some point from the analysis, and they, with the other people, obtained the same result. So here, it seems to me that there is very little, at least intuitively, very little policy selection involved. So I wonder whether relying on this sort of internalized active inference framework is the right strategy to go for this particular condition, where they really wanted them to have no idea that there was any degree of subjective, even potential control on this task.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I would respond to it in two ways. I'll first sort of put on my Friston mask and I think say what I'll put on my Philip mask. That's easier. And then I'll say what I really think about it as myself, right, as not a predictive coder. But I think what Philip would say is that there doesn't have to be awareness of this policy in order for the process to be taking place, right? So if you haven't read the paper, sorry, just the analogy is sort of like, if I want my marriage to do well, I sort of tend to perceive states in a slightly biased way. That's a sort of very high-level metaphor. But I think what they do in this paper is they have very sort of low-level subpersonal policy with the example, for example, of dopamine, right? And so I think the fact that the participant isn't aware of what the policy is, but still responds appropriately is something that they would be fairly content to swallow. Now, pulling off my Philip mask, this is something that I find really dissatisfying, right? And so I agree, and I think that's a really nice objection where there are other resources out there that can explain more elegantly what's going on in the reward case, and it includes this complete awareness of what the task was, right? So yeah, I think that's a great objection. It's actually kind of grist for my mill. But I think that's how Philip would try and address that, or that's how he's addressed that question, if I remember correctly.
Can I just clarify just a little bit? So the thing is that I wasn't talking about awareness of the policy selection per se, because it's pretty obvious that this whole sort of inferential processes can go on unconsciously. I was addressing more the fact that in the basic empirical Bayesian framework, when they have a perception and action not integrated, as you say, it's pretty clear that I can sample the world in a certain way by simply looking in directions, right? For example, so if I want to keep my model fixed and find new data that confirms it, I might move around or do something like that. Here, what seems to me to be the important point is not that they're not aware of the policy, but that they're not aware that they are, in a sense, in control of what is going on.
You just cut out. Can you say that again? Just the last phrase.
In a sense, they're not aware that they can be, to a degree, in control of what of what is going on, right? There seems to be no way in which they can look differently or scan the scene differently that will affect what I see. And it seems to me that this sort of let's call it control is probably not the appropriate term, but just to give an idea, it's relevant when the deployment of active inference is the switch to active inference is involved. So I'm not sure how this pans out into when you internalize active inference and bring them together. But I just wanted to clarify that I was not referring to the awareness of the inference process, but to awareness of the sort of controllability, subjectivity of the task, in a sense. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, and that's something that Colin Klein and I have talked about a little bit down the hall, that we find, and again, this is the Julia mask, not the predictive coder mask. The way this paper is structured is like, okay, what would a predictive coder do? But I think there's an important question about how the alternation takes place on the empirical Bayes account. I'm not sure I always understand how an organism knows when to perceive and when to act, right? What if I need to perceive and act? There's some sort of task switching there that I think is not fully specified. But I think the same problem gets carried over into variational Bayes. It's not clear how that works. And I suspect what Philip might say is there are ways of specifying that. But of course, I am a bit weary of that type of specification in a model like this. So yeah, I think that's a great point.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks for being a discussant.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. I wanted to start with a fairly specific and short question. Are you aware of any actual experiment trying to test how we and colleagues model of binocular rivalry?
No.
Okay.
You sound a bit like Sam Gershman when you say that.
That's a compliment.
Yeah, I think it really is.
Yeah.
And my
No, again, that was mainly out of curiosity because, as you know, there are a bunch of different models of binocular rivalry, and I would be very interested in, finding out whether there is any, experiment trying to test, the predictions of these different models. But anyway, I mean, I have another set of general questions about the rationality of perception. Yes.
On that? So
Yeah.
I fully agree with you, and I think the Gershman model is good. I think there are other, we both have a Sam Gershman crush. This is being recorded. But the point is that I think in philosophy, this paper has a huge hold, right? And so there are philosophers, but there are also philosophers, and I think I, for myself, because I come from the reinforcement literature more than anything else, wanted to sort of explore this for myself. And this paper is sort of like, here's what I found. Like, I found this doesn't work as well as we think. So I'm actually perfectly content with there being better explanations out there. But I also I want to put a little bit of pressure on this one because it has this sort of iconic status, right? So that's just the idea there. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for. I sympathize with the project, let's say. Yeah. I have a set of general questions on a different topic, and the topic is the rationality of perception. Mm-hmm. At the very beginning of your talk, you mentioned reliability as a possible basis for epistemic justification. Now, if you buy into this variational Bayes model of binocular rivalry, I'm curious about say what basis for justification you would get. I mean, towards the end of your talk, you mentioned instrumentalism as a possible alternative, and I wanted to know whether you have any more specific idea again about what kind of basis for justification that move would get you.
Yeah, so this is kind of a little bit about. Sorry, I'm getting an echo. I think this is kind of a little bit of where my work is going to go next. And so I think the first task is honestly just kind of getting the theoretical landscape a bit clearer. To see what the alternatives are. I actually don't think that the variational Bayes picture of perception is right, but I do think that there are various models of top-down influences on perception that are going to be different than just top-down influences of belief, right? So there's going to be beliefs and just obviously something like desires, which I think some people mention, Stokes mentions it, McPherson mentions it, but there are going to be other ones, valuational influences. And I think, to be honest, I'm tempted to go a little bit empirical, which is rare for me, and say that the process required for justification depends on which top-down model we're looking at. And so the first thing that we're going to have to do is figure out, okay, what kinds of top-down effects do we want to look at in perception? I would want to look at a valuational one, and then look at the array of alternatives. Here's just a couple of ways you might want to go about this. Let's say that you think the value has a top-down effect on perception. Maybe the knee-jerk reaction is to say, hey, I should be really worried about this. I can't really trust anything that I perceive, right? There are these bumper stickers in America that are like, don't believe everything you think, don't believe everything you see, right? And I think that's kind of an important consideration. It's at least an end limit view that we need to have about justification. But that said, I think that there are traditional resources in epistemology for getting around this issue. I just think that they need to be specific, not just to beliefs, but also to values or rewards or desires or something like that. So that's a very global answer, but it's a way of saying that's exactly what I want to think about now. And if you have any thoughts on it, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, we might have a chat about this
Yeah,
offline maybe.
in private.
Uh,
Yeah.
shall I continue with my questions or?
Yeah, of Please. course.
Okay. Another question I have, again related, is what do you think Howie and colleagues have in mind when they talk about rational explanation? I mean, in what sense is the account they give of binocular rivalry is rational? And again, this is related to what you just mentioned in terms of basis for justification of perceptual output.
I actually think that, to be fair, and this is an empirical question, I could just be wrong about this, but I think what I would say is that um, it's a rational explanation in the sense that it's a unusual or maybe suboptimal or whatever you want to say it, weird byproduct of an otherwise, by their lights, optimizing Bayesian system, right? So it's like, here is this rule. It does, it approaches optimality. Your Bayes rational. That's great. Once in a while, in this very non-ecological setting, it spits out this bullshit alternating thing, and you're thinking, oh, that's crazy. It must, And so I take them to say that it's rational in that sense and not anything more fancy. And to be fair, like, I think that's a really nice. I think that's an explanatory virtue. If you can show that something unexpected is just the run-of-the-mill byproduct of the thing that's otherwise working great, I actually think that's a good outcome in the mind. So I think that's what they're after. The question is whether they're right? But I don't know. You might have a different take on what they mean, and you might have better insight into what they were after there.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. See, the background here is Bayesianism and Bayesian conditioning as an epistemic norm. Well, I mean, there are different ways of justifying, Bayesianism in epistemology. One traditional way is to show that it provides you with a basic constraint on consistency. There are Dutch book arguments to that effect. So this is related to my first question in terms of coherentism. That is, if you buy into this picture of perception rather than using reliability as a basis for justification, maybe a different basis for justification more apt would be coherence. And again, I was wondering whether you have any idea on this, also in relation to the stuff on adaptive value, because again, it's not obvious that coherence would track adaptivity.
Yeah, this is actually something I know very little about. So coherence measures or incoherence measures in sort of formal idealizing epistemology. I actually think that I see those things as sort of not immediately connected just yet. Or I think that there would have to be a lot of work done to bridge those two literatures. But that might just be a function of my knowing very little about it. So I'd have to think more about that. It sounds like you have something specific in mind.
Nothing specific really. It's more a question about again the rationality of perception. If you don't buy into reliabilism, then from traditional epistemology, another option is coherentism. And when it comes to the justification of Bayesian conditioning, some of the results show you that what it really gets you is a basic constraint on consistency. That is, insofar as you stick to Bayesian conditioning, your belief set will be probabilistically coherent, which doesn't mean it's going to track the truth, although there are results that show you that it might. But again, it's not obvious.
Interesting. It's not something. Yeah. That's not something I know very much about, actually.
The last thing I wanted to ask you has to do with your proposal about understanding these quasi, perceptions in terms of push me pull you representations. And I was wondering, say, how this move would make room for desires as, traditionally understood in folk psychological terms. That is, should we eliminate desire as a folk psychological category and replace it, and also belief, and replace them with, this more basic, in a way, type of state, that is the push me, pull you kind of state. So what's your take on how to reconfigure our understanding of these folk psychological categories of belief and desire in the light of the results you've been discussing?
Yeah, so this is something that I have a better picture for in terms of the valuational framework rather than the variational. I think I just want to extend the same possibility, the same out to the variational Bayes people as I want to give myself in the valuational. But let me kind of take your question backwards, right? So I take the variational Bayes in its best form, if we take it on board, or the valuational picture of perception as both directive and descriptive, right? So depending on how you describe it, right, it's always this sort of ratcheting effect of predicted or expected value, right? So it's got both of these features depending on how you want to describe them. So I think the first step is to establish that it is in fact something like a push me, pull you representation, but you and I have talked about this a little bit, and it's at least possible. It seems more cautious to describe it as a push me, pull you representation than to go whole hog and say all of perception is mind to world, right? That's just bound to like make people angry. But supposing that you do that, supposing you do one of those two things, I think that this is going to be a structure, a cognitive structure, a structure of process in the mind that takes place in perception, it takes place in decision making, it takes place, and I think desire might be one instance, one complicated instance of something that has this structure. And so I think that there are going to be contexts where we're going to want to get rid of desires because they don't have the explanatory power. There are going to, but I don't think we should get rid of, not in the full Churchlandian level. So it, as you have yourself suggested, I think it's probably reasonable in some cases and not in others. I think what I think is problematic and what I would be happy to get away with is sort of the idea of desires as these base units that just operate in a particular way and that they're sort of black boxes. And it's like, actually, I think even if we want to take desire in the folk psychological sense seriously, then we're starting to get resources to really be able to dig into that. And what does that mean? And we can finesse the folk psychological concept if we want to keep it. Something like that. So, yeah, I don't know.
That's great. Thanks. That's very helpful.
Thanks, Matteo.
Yeah, so first of all, just thank you for a great talk. I got a lot out of it. And I think I agree with the majority of what you said. But there were kind of 2 points that I wanted to press you on, or 3 actually. So the first is kind of like a big picture question. So as I'm sure everyone's aware, predictive coding kind of originated in the signal processing literature and was then kind of exported to perceptual neuroscience. And it wasn't until like approximately recently that it was kind of used to explain other phenomena outside of perception. So I guess what my question is to what extent do you think this kind of like very epistemic, perceptual, domain neutral view of predictive coding is something that's held by a lot of contemporary predictive coders, or if it's kind of like a historical artifact that pervades the literature just because of its origin in signal processing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think it's an artifact of its history, but I think it's a perfect storm in the sense that it's an artifact also of the history of philosophy. So I think, my original training or my early training is in early modern philosophy, and that's one of the places, and you can also look to it in ancient, but one of the places where you start to see serious studies of perception is among the empiricists. And precisely what they're interested in doing is countering the rationalists and trying to understand, okay, if we understand perception, then we don't have to be so worried about the variable, unreliable external world, right? The world that brought us the sun, orbiting the earth, and all of that, right? And so right away, philosophical conceptions of perception have all of this epistemological baggage, right? And so I think there's room in predictive coding for that picture to shift. I think the philosophical interest kind of bakes in this theoretical picture to start with, and that's one obstacle. I think another obstacle comes from the other side, from the side that I work in more, the reinforcement learning side, which is reinforcement learners are always going to say, what about reward? What about reward? And there's been this move in predictive coding to try to be able to account for the role of reward on this very neutral Bayesian account, right? And so by insulating itself away from this, I think it actually just reinforces the theoretical neutrality of the predictive coding account. I don't think either of these things are decisive, but I do see those multiple trends in addition to the one that you describe as playing a role. And that's hopefully what I'm sort of indirectly pressing back against a little bit.
Okay, cool. So the second thing I kind of wanted to ask you leads on from that. So you referenced just then to this kind of attempt to bring in or kind of pay closer attention to reward. And I completely agree with that. So homeostasis and interoception really has kind of been at the forefront of a lot of the literature in predictive coding, especially in computational psychiatry, and it plays a really big role in explanations of a lot of mental health disorders. And I think on this kind of view, where you really are paying close attention to homeostasis and interoceptive prediction error, something like conditioning perceptual priors on rewards really is quite natural. So specifically, I was thinking of Lisa Feldman Barrett and her group. And so they have this really cool model where they have a model of the inferential hierarchy that puts visceromotor cortices at the top of the predictive hierarchy. And so these then have feedback connections throughout the cortex. And they argue, I don't think they have any direct evidence for this, or not any that I'm aware of, but they argue that these kind of send predictions to sensory cortices on the basis or aiming to minimize interoceptive prediction error ultimately. And so if you have this kind of view, I just think it kind of falls out very naturally that, yeah, like we will, if one percept is rewarded, then we will select it, because that, if it's conditioned on a policy, that policy will be more likely if it's kind of rewarding in a sense, because it'll best minimize expected free energy. Mm-hmm. In the sense that expected free energy is kind of, what we're minimizing is interoceptive prediction error over the long term. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense.
So to what extent have you kind of like looked into this, or have you thought about how the view that you advocate for kind of fits in with this broader picture of interoception?
Sorry, the broader view being something like variational based?
Yeah, so how the view that I know you don't hold this view, but the variational Bayes picture, do you think have you thought about how that fits in with kind of broader conceptions of predictive coding that place a lot of emphasis on interoception?
That's not something I know a terrible amount about. I have seen Feldman Barrett present on this. It's something that I think for me, once you start having these more complicated accounts of various stripes, be they hers or other versions, the Schwarzenbeck version that I use in this paper, I think what becomes important for me is, for lack of a better word, like parsimony. So how simple is your theory? How much do you have to build into it? And how much can it predict given the other things that I've just described? I wouldn't be in a position to assess the Feldman-Barrett view. But I think in terms of your question, in terms of something like just accounting for reward, there are simpler solutions out there. And they are more predictive. And so I think that's what Matteo was also getting at in his question about, for example, even if you just stick with binocular rivalry, there are theories out there that account for more of the data in a way. I don't think that's necessarily devastating. That's how we pick and choose between theories. But I think these appeals to sort of, particularly to account for reward, tend to be pretty built in. They get to be pretty loaded up, and I do think that that's in general a problem, although I'm less familiar with the particular view that you are referring to. Or just, I'm less familiar with the specific math of the one that you're referring to.
Yeah, to my...
That's your answer.
Oh, no, sorry. To my knowledge, I don't know if her group has actually done anything quantitative. So I'm not really sure if there's anything more than kind of diagrams.
Yeah, it's
Sorry.
just something I don't know enough about. But I think, it's 1,000 flowers bloom. I am quite partisan to my reward-based accounts, but I definitely think it's fair to mention that the predictive coding accounts try to account for reward. The question is just, how do we want to evaluate those views?
Okay, cool. So the last question, it's more just a question about terminology. So to my knowledge, at least, or at least the maths behind most predictive coding that I've come across, with the exception of Rao and Ballard's model, all of it uses variational Bayes. It's just an approximation technique like Monte Carlo Markov chains. And so to what when you say variational Bayes, what are you kind of singling out here as this reward-based view? Is it kind of a part of the free energy principle more broadly? Is it active inference?
Yeah, so I'm thinking of a specific series of papers by Kristen and colleagues, one variation of which produces optimism bias. So I wouldn't even attribute it to a general class. It's literally a specific sequence with particular specifications that gets you optimism bias. Again, that really should narrow the kind of charges that we bring down on this view. It was more kind of an exercise of like, okay, I will take you at your word. What can you do with this version of the account, right? And what follows from that? And so, yeah, it shouldn't come down on all versions, but it should come down on the version that claims to explain it, right? So, yeah, that's definitely a footnote that should be added.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
So yeah, thanks, Julia. I guess the one thing I wanted to hear a little bit more about was the stuff about the policy selection, and in particular, why it gives you optimism bias. Now, we talked about this a little bit, or I sent you some comments before, but it does seem like, I mean, if the idea is that you're more likely to see things that are there and would be rewarding, it also seems like for various policies it would be useful, like in some intuitive sense of policies, to be able to see things that would, say, stymie your ends, that would be bad or disrewarding. So it seems like just moving to policies should still give you the same problems as like attention or salience or something like that. So I was wondering what there was to say about that.
Yeah, I fully agree with you on that. And I don't know if you heard the discussant's questions about this. But the question is, were you there for that part? Where he was
I heard part of it, but
yeah. So the way that it gets accounted for in the model is basically that you optimize precision, which isn't particularly illuminating, because I take your point.
Yeah.
There are lots of things that you want to see that aren't necessarily aren't the result of an optimistic picture, right? And so in a lot of respects, I think it doesn't resolve this issue at all. What you could do is to try and optimize precision to capture just the right picture of what you're perceiving. So neither too precise nor too imprecise, to give you the right balance of things. But exactly how an organism would arrive at that optimization is not clear to me.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess I can see, and this is, as you know by now, one of my general worries about this, I can see an assignment of, for example, precision